much for letting us in on a topic that you know inside out for many years, and that is certainly of interest for a wide community in so many contexts. I'm sure you're mentioning most of them. I understand there are quite a few colleagues on the screens, and this is also recorded. So good morning or good afternoon to all of you who are out there, and it will be recorded. So whatever the time is. My name is Eva Damestjerne. It's the first time that I'm Forest Technical Coordinator Network Leader here. So that's me, the new one. I understand that there were 4 in the last year. Let's see how long I last in this position. It's certainly a pleasure to have the opportunity to connect people, because that's what you have in the technical network. It's also a pleasure to have the ADG with me, supporting me on this new role. And I'm sure you'd like to say a few words to colleagues before we hand over to Peter.
Thank you, Ron, and also thank you, Peter, for having these opportunities. And also, Roland with all staff is very much interested in these fire issues. And of course, I was about to say, now in the most part, we are now getting the season for the first fires. And then also myself will be the touch upon the fire management in the past, and of course the traditional way we were setting up as a fire belt in the forest, and so many main task is how to just prevent these fires. But nowadays, we cannot prevent. Yeah. So now, also another issue, how to just recover after fires, maybe this is one of the issues. And another one also, maybe impacts from the ski grounds. Also, this is quite serious in case of Indonesia. It's a long time ago, we have a history with that. But anyway, also, okay, once also let me to also introduce my quite private matters. Also, my father-in-law is a firefighter in the mountain areas. After we were eager to just make an assignment in the forest fire management, so I want to know some of the tips from your knowledge. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I think it's true that everybody has a firefighter somewhere in their family, so I'm sure all of you have got one. This presentation is designed to sort of not teach you, but introduce you to some of the basics. We see a lot of things, and I'll refer to them as we go through, but a lot of people don't understand what you really must know about fire management. And if you do know those things, it's actually really simple. So I probably shouldn't be making this presentation, because then you could all do what I do, and so you won't need me anymore. But let's see how we go. What we'll go through, and there will be a quiz afterwards on what's happening, is the first 2 steps are the ones I really want you to take away some ideas or some thoughts of. Fire behaviour and fire science, that's the basis upon which all things happen, and those things will not happen if the science and the behaviour is not present. The limitations of suppression, this is based on the physics and the chemistry, but it's really important for the politics. Really important for the politics. So those 2 things are the things that I really would like you to consider as we go through. And then the general situation. What are the numbers of fires around the world? What are fire causes? There is a global framework, the disaster risk reduction framework, that fires fall under. And then what are we doing in this room? And from this room and in the regions. Fire management should be 95% routine. You can replace that with the word boring if you like, and it should only be 5% not so routine. One of the things that's often not so routine is technology, and so the link to show you 4 or 5 minutes of fire in a peat swamp in Indonesia isn't working. So our not so routine is not very exciting, so I can't show you the 5%. It's a bit of a shame. We might try and get it up afterwards. So fire behaviour, fire misbehaviour. It's the main factor that determines how people manage or live with or work with fires. A clear understanding of it is essential. If you don't understand the fire behaviour, then you may as well not be doing any planning, any organising, any logistics or anything else in relation to fire management. Just as examples, a grass fire in Sudan will be burning in about 0.8 tonnes per hectare, that's 800 kilograms per hectare of fine fuel, mainly grass. At certain times of the year more than that. The campfire in California burnt through an average of 30 tonnes per hectare of fine fuel for the duration of its run, over about 5 or 6 hours. So they're obviously very different situations. So if you don't go into the field to your sites and things and you're not looking at the weight, type and arrangement of the fuel, then you're missing a key part of the puzzle. And that's one of the things we need to help our field colleagues and in projects understand that you need to keep an eye on this. It may mean nothing, but it could mean an enormous amount. Fire people, fire managers will talk to you about the fire triangle without any support at all. The moment you say anything, they will tell you about the fire triangle. The reason is because it's a really simple way of understanding the basics. You need oxygen for a fire to burn. It's a combustion process, it's an oxidation process. And a fire can burn with less oxygen than we need for breathing. There's 21% oxygen in the atmosphere. You need 19% to keep breathing. The fire only needs 16% to keep burning. So we can't take enough oxygen away to deal with that side of the triangle. When the heat is high enough, it'll ignite the fuel and sustain its burning. How high? Some of you may have heard of a book by Kurt Vonnegut called Fahrenheit 451. That's the combustion temperature, 260 degrees Celsius, of paper. And more or less, that's what we're talking about. The fuel has to be at 260 degrees to start burning. And fuel is the stuff that is burning. It's the only side of the triangle that we can do anything about. Sometimes we do good things and we reduce it or rearrange it in ways that make fire better or simpler to manage. At other times we don't do so good things and we increase the amount of fuel that's around and we give ourselves a bigger problem. Okay, what's fuel? Well, it's classified and these are the parts of the fuel framework. There's surface fine fuels, that's litter, grass, things that are lying on the forest floor or on the floor. Near surface fine fuels, they're the fuels that are from your foot to about your knee. They're really important because extreme fire behaviour works in that space. It needs that space for things to happen. Elevated fine fuels, things that are up in the tree or higher than your knee, up above your head. Bark fuels, not so much a problem in most parts of the world, but if you have eucalypts, barks are a real problem. Unfortunately, and I apologise unreservedly on behalf of my country, we've exported eucalypts all over the world and they're causing all sorts of trouble in many places. And one of the problems they bring with them is the bark problem. Canopy fine fuels, the leaves and needles in the canopy, and then the coarse fuels on the ground. You'll notice through this presentation that I'm talking about fuels. When I mean that, if I haven't specified it, I'm talking about fine fuels. These are fuels less than 5 millimetres in diameter, so less than a pencil. They're the ones that ignite first and burn the fastest. So they're the ones that we're really concerned about. Okay, what does that look like in the field? This is a sort of practical operational approach to assessing fine fuel in the field. You look at the ground, so for every 10% of cover and 2 centimetres of depth, you have 1 tonne of fine fuel per hectare. So if you have 90% of litter coverage on the ground in a 2 metre circle, and you have 4 centimetres of litter depth, you have 18 tonnes of fine fuel per hectare. So this is beneath your feet. Then you estimate the elevated fuels by dividing things into ground to knee, knee to waist, waist to shoulder. So these are the near surface fuels that I mentioned before. And you estimate percentage coverage, and that estimation gives you a rule of thumb figure. And you calculate the total fine fuels by adding it all up. Okay, terrific. So what? If you have 10 tonnes of fine fuel per hectare, you have a problem. You have a firefighting problem. If a fire starts in 10 tonnes of fine fuel per hectare, you have enormous amounts of trouble suppressing that fire. It doesn't sound like very much, and that's because it is not very much. 10 tonnes a hectare is about 2 centimetres of litter layer on 100% of the surface area. I'm sure many of you, many times, have seen more than that, or walked through more than that. So next time you go to the field, poke down through the little layer and have a look and see how deep it is to mineral soil. Of course, we've got the fuel. If we have enough fuel, then we need to know what drives the behaviour of the fuel. Fuel moisture content, how wet or how dry the fuel is the key thing. If it's too wet, it can't burn, and therefore you don't have a problem. If it's really dry, then it can burn. It's expressed as a percentage of dry weight, and it's really affected by recent rainfall. Remember, this is fine fuel, so it's not the heavy things, it's fine fuel, so it absorbs moisture out of the atmosphere. Soil dryness, the litter and the logs and things will be in contact with the soil. If the soil is wet, then the litter and the logs will become more wet, more moist. If it's dry, then the moisture will go from the litter to the soil. It's also influenced by temperature and humidity and by exposure to sunlight. So we've got fuel. What causes fire behaviour? Wind is the most important factor in fire behaviour. Full stop. And it's by a significant margin. Some of you will remember the fire last year in Greece, 2018, that killed 100 people. The moisture content of fuels was over 30%, 40 to 50%. The temperature was 31 degrees, the relative humidity was 34%. The fire went because the slowest wind speed was 56 kilometres an hour, and it gusted to 80. That's why the fire burned and killed people. Under normal conditions, it wouldn't have caused any real problem. The other things, the way wind does that is it feeds oxygen into the fire. It's unit oxygen per unit time. If the wind is moving, the fire's getting more oxygen passed across it. It causes the flame to tilt, which increases the radiant heat on the fuel ahead of it, which means it warms up more quickly and dries out. And it causes the embers, bits of burnt material that detach, to then blow forward. Stronger the wind, the further they can go. This is where the eucalypts become a problem for you, because the bark of eucalypts comes off, it hangs in the tree, it rolls up into cylinders in some cases, and when they detach, they can travel a very long way and start a fire. So again, I apologise, but that's wind-driven, spot fires are wind-driven. 3 and 4, relative humidity. Here in Rome in August, we complain a lot about how high the humidity is. If you've lived in Hanoi or Bangkok or other places, we complain about the humidity. I never complain about humidity. If it's above 30%, I'm really happy, because if it's above 30%, the fuel is taking on moisture, and I have less of a problem to worry about. So the fuel absorbs and releases water. Fuel will always try and balance itself out with the atmosphere. Everything will, but fuel does it in particular. So if it's 10% and the atmosphere is 50%, it will try and absorb moisture to get to 50%. It takes a certain amount of time, but it will constantly be trying to do that. Similarly, if it's inverse, if the fuel is 50% moisture content and the atmosphere is 10%, then the fuel will lose moisture in the same way. This is really important. Low relative humidities in fire terms are 30% or below 30% atmospheric moisture, relative humidity, which is not particularly low. It's low, but it's not particularly low. In extreme fire weather conditions, where I come from, in Australia, you can have relative humidities of 9%. The worst I've seen was 3. It wasn't fun at all. So relative humidity, the wind is the strongest influence, and relative humidity is the second influence. relative humidity because it influences the fuel's moisture content. Air temperature and direct sunlight, they dry the fuel because it's in the sun. You know yourselves, it's warmer in the sun than in the shade. It is much less important than relative humidity and almost unimportant compared to wind. What is important about temperature is that the general public and the community have made a connection between summer and high temperatures and fires. So when we say there's going to be high temperatures, there is a sort of a connection there amongst most people that we could possibly have fires. So while it's incorrect, it can be useful in a communication sense about things. Another key factor is topography. A fire that travels uphill will double its rate of spread. It'll go twice as fast for every 10-degree change in slope. So a fire that's doing 100 metres an hour on the flat land will do 400 metres an hour up a hill of 20%. I probably don't need to remind you that humans don't go faster uphill. So this is particularly useful for safety. So if you're above a fire and it's below you on a slope, just remember that it will accelerate up the slope. And of course the inverse takes place. Fires go more slowly downhill than they do uphill, again by a factor of 2. I don't apologise at all for this, or what I'm about to say in the next slide. It is about the physics and the combustion. If you don't have the combustion, if you don't have heat, if you don't have fuel, if you don't have oxygen, then you won't have a fire. So you need to understand the chemistry of the process, because that's what we produce. Whether we're helping in the forest and farm facility, whether we're managing mountains, whether we're helping with livelihoods, we're producing fuel. That's my view, it's not your view, I understand that, but that's what we're doing. What happens if you have pure cellulose and you get it to 260 degrees Celsius, then this is the chemical reaction it will go through. The really important thing is that it will release around about 18,000 kilojoules per kilogram of fuel burnt. Just keep that in your mind because we'll talk about it quite a bit in the next few slides. The figures on heat release vary slightly, but everybody uses 18,000 as a sort of midpoint. I mentioned in the triangle, there's 3 elements to the reaction: oxygen, heat and fuel, which we talked about. So the triangle, very easy to remember, and those 3 parts. It's chemistry and it's physics, please remember that. If you go into a country and they say they've got a fire problem and they start talking to you about herdsmen or graziers or rice farmers, that's fine, but what are they burning and how is it burning? It's about the chemistry and the physics in the first instance. If we don't understand that, then we can't talk to the herdsman properly about what they should be doing, or to the rice farmer. That's pure cellulose. This is what it looks like when you burn peat. So this is what the quiz is about. Everybody has to get at least 12 of these products in the test. I'll give you a hand because hydrogen cyanide is in there, so's methane, so's a lot of things. This is a really nasty mix of things. And it points to one of the big impacts that fires have, which is on health. Both on the health of people who are close to the event. Over 90% of these things drop out very, very quickly. So if you're fighting a fire, don't worry about hydrogen cyanide too much. And don't worry about methanol too much. You won't be getting drunk on the amount that comes out of this. But what does happen is that all those species that are emitted cause lots of trouble, downwind and downstream. The Indonesian fires in 2016, it's estimated that about 100,000 extra people died as a result of those fires. Nobody died in the fires, but about 100,000 people died as a result in health-related impacts. So we know that we need fuel, we know what the 3 parts of the triangle are, we know what sort of energy comes off it. What are the world records? You will see all sorts of things in the media. These figures are the ones that have been verified by somebody who's done a systematic assessment. They can move as fast as 10.8 kilometres per hour in forests. Now if you think about that for a minute, That's not too slow, not too fast. People run marathons at twice that speed. Usain Bolt runs 3 times that speed. All of us walk at 6 kilometres an hour. So we're not talking about something that's really, really, really fast. We're talking about something that's, and remember, this is the world record. 22 kilometres an hour in grasslands because the wind is more directly influencing the fire. Now we're getting to the point where Usain Bolt gets away, but the rest of us are in trouble. Spot fires can go as far as 20 kilometres. That's my personal guaranteed measured distance. People talk about 30 and they talk about other distances, but in terms of verified distances, that's the only one I can verify. 20 kilometres is still a very, very long way. So Usain Bolt would be in front of the fire, but he can't run this far. So he's in trouble as well by now. Flame heights have been recorded at 30 metres. You will see them at twice tree height on really bad days and things like that. So they could be 50, but the measurement of them. Fire line intensities, that's the energy release rate. Remember, fuel, 18,000 kilojoules per kilogram. Release rates of 100,000 kilowatts per metre of flame front. So this much flame, 100,000 kilowatts, which is kilojoules per second, 100,000 kilojoules per second per metre. These are really big numbers. If you ever see any of these things, say various prayers, ring your family, whatever. These are really dangerous, but fortunately very, very unusual. They only occur in less than 5% of fires. So I've been involved in fire management for more or less 40 years now. I've seen this 4 times. That's 4 times too many, I'd have to say, but 4 times. So what does it look like when it's burning? This is a peat swamp forest in Indonesia. This one's in central Kalimantan. This is actually a peat fire. So we talked about surface fuels, but this fire is actually burning underneath in the peat. As you can see, it's smoky. It's not particularly dramatic, not particularly frightening. Surface fires. So these are fires that are only burning in the fuel in contact with the ground and perhaps some of the near surface fuel. You can see this isn't a particularly bad day. In fact, this is a prescribed burn. But the flames are 0.5 metre, 0.75 metre, maybe up to a metre. Crown fire. So this is where you can see, perhaps in the right-hand photograph, that main plume shooting out. That's probably 30 metres, could even be 40 or something like that. Most of the time fires look like this. If you have 10 tonnes of fuel and the conditions aren't too bad, this is what most of it looks like. And most of the time firefighting looks like this. Now this isn't what you see on the television, and it isn't what you see in the pictures that illustrate various articles or magazines, but most of the time this is what it looks like. And believe me, it's a really good thing that this is what it looks like most of the time, because this is the 90%. Very occasionally we get extraordinary events, extreme fire events they're called. This one's the Fort McMurray fire in Edmonton, in Canada. It was in May of 2016. They evacuated an entire city, Fort McMurray, 100,000 people. More than 2,600 homes were destroyed, and the burned area was over 500,000 hectares. I think the final figure is 850 or something like that. Nobody died at all. Now that's a reflection of the fact that Canada has an experience in this. They have good infrastructure, they have good emergency services, they have police, good communications and all of those sorts of things. Conversely, this was a really high impact fire in Ethiopia. It was in 2000. Again, nobody was killed by the fire, but it burned a fairly large area. And the implications of that were that there was significant loss of timber and fuel wood, which these people relied on, loss of grazing and livestock opportunities, And it will take somewhere between a year and 3 years for those things to come back. So even though Fort McMurray was really dramatic, this fire in Ethiopia probably had a higher long-term impact. Not to the ecology and so on, and of course the loss of livelihoods. So as FAO, we don't really deal with Fort McMurray because Canada has its own system, the US has its own system, Western Europe has its system. We don't really need to work with them. We do need to work with Ethiopia because they don't have the same sort of capacities. You remember the two things I mentioned? One was fire behaviour and fire science. The second one was the limits of suppression of 18,000 kilojoules per kilogram. If you walk away with that stuck in your head, that's a really good thing too. So all means of firefighting, ground troops, people on the ground, pumps, all those sorts of things, and aerial and planes, the maximum fire line intensity for working directly on the fire. So I stand here, the fire's there, and we're working on suppressing the fire, is 4,000 kilowatts per metre. Flames could be 3 metres high, and the fire will be moving at about 400 metres per hour in 10 tonnes of fuel. Not very fast. Usain Bolt would not even bother to get out of the blocks until an hour's passed. Indirect attack, so the fire's too strong and too much energy for us to attack directly, it's 10,000 kilowatts per metre. Our flames are now 7 metres high, so this is pretty scary. You know, this is 3 times any of us, perhaps 2 times Jaakko because he's Finnish. But and the spread rate is now 1,800 metres per hour. It's still not. It's not going to overwhelm you. You're not going to get caught by this in the bush somewhere. Extreme wildfires, Pedro Grande in Portugal in 2017, fire line intensities were 20,000 to 60,000. They're conservative, in my opinion. So 20,000 kilowatts per metre. So 20,000 kilojoules per second per metre. The latent heat of vaporisation of water, I told you it wasn't going to be straightforward, is 2,200 or so kilowatts. So that means that for a fire of 4,000 kilowatts, we need about 8 litres of water per kilowatt. For 20,000, we're starting to look at thousands and thousands and thousands of litres of water. You need half an Olympic-sized swimming pool for a fire that's doing that. Just think for a minute how difficult it is to move this stuff around the place. Like how much plumbing we have. We have dams, we have pipes. Here in Rome we have all of the aqueducts and everything else. Civilizations have spent enormous amounts of effort moving water because it's very difficult to do. And so the idea of moving enough water onto a fire to put it out is a little bit silly. In fact, it's a lot silly. Only 3% of all the wildfires in Canada, I use Canada because the Canadians are probably the best at what I do of anybody, and they've got really good records and really good science. Only 3% of all the fires, so all of the thousands of fires in Canada in any year, only 3% are bigger than 200 hectares. But those 3% account for 97% of the area burnt. So the profile is lots of relatively small fires and then a few really, really big ones. Now for Canada in some cases, and Boreal Russia and a few other places, Northern Australia, sometimes that doesn't matter because there's nobody there, it's part of an ecological process and it's not particularly problematic. But sometimes it does. Those figures are the same for Australia where I come, they're the same for Western Europe. You know, Western Europe, the bulk of the fires, 90+%, are less than a hectare or 2 or 3 hectares in size. But a few others blow up the numbers. Okay, so what does the limits of suppression mean? This is a grass fire in Italy a few years ago. This is an aeroplane, it's called a Canadair 415. Don't ask me in public my opinion of these things because I have to use language that the clergy and my mother would not approve of. And this is a field crew. The field crew is just as effective as the aeroplane. And you need the field crew to put the fire out, because they're the ones on the ground that will make sure it's out. The pilot in the plane and the observer can't tell you the fire's out. They can tell you there's less smoke, whatever. So you need the people on the ground. These two things are the same in suppression terms. Okay, so we know what the fire triangle is. We know we need fuel. We know that wind is a really key factor, and we know that the energy release in these things exceeds the ready capacity to fight them. And if we were doing it with water, we'd need so much water that we wouldn't have time or the capacity to get it into place. What's happening globally? The Global Fire Emissions Database is a generally accepted, strong third-party set of data. It's about emissions from fires, but nonetheless it collects all the area. There's, in 2015, not a particularly broadly bad season. There were 54 million hectares and 670,000 active fire detections in the year across the world. So about 4% of the global vegetation surface of the planet burns every year. In the EU, in that 17-year period from 2000 to 2017, 611 people were killed, 8.5 million hectares was burnt, and it was 54 billion euros in costs, damage and losses. The damage and losses that people assess for fires are often completely inadequate. They talk about the timber value, they talk about a few other things. They don't talk about the dislocation of populations. They don't talk about the cost and stresses of rebuilding houses and homes. They don't talk about business disruption. They don't talk about impacts on supply lines and things like that. So these figures are highly conservative. And FAO is actually part of a process to try and work out how we properly quantify damage and loss from fires. Just a list there of some of the more significant events that you might have heard of. I'd suggest that most of you have probably heard of Indonesia in 2015, Portugal, particularly if you live in Europe, Canada, the US, which is heading into its fourth bad year. You'll hear about California again, I expect, in this coming summer. Chile, which had 3 bad seasons, and Greece, of course, which had 2007, 2018. Most of you probably haven't heard anything about India, and probably not very much about Tanzania, that burns 11 million hectares per annum on average. Why not? Firstly, the media in that part of the world is not very densely concentrating. Secondly, it's not of interest. Generally, I mean, the Tanzania fires, they don't hurt anybody, nobody gets killed, the losses and damage are very low, even though it's 11 million hectares. And then in India, it was the one season that they had a couple of years ago. You probably know something about what went on. Yeah. So what that tells you is that we hear a lot about fires in developed countries, where people get threatened, where there are cameras ready to hand and so on. We don't hear very much at all about fires in other places, even though, as I pointed out with Ethiopia, the impacts might be longer term and for a larger group of people. Area burnt, there's a trend of increasing costs. The impacts are increasing as well, natural environment, livelihoods, social and economic costs and so on. Globally, the area being burnt by fires is declining. It's declined in the last 2 decades. Even though the impacts and the damage are going up and the profile's going up, the global area burnt is actually reducing. Part of the perception we have is because of a reporting bias. Everybody heard about California last summer. Everybody heard about Canada. We heard a lot about various things in Chile. So what we're hearing and the sense we get is not necessarily reflecting the data that you would look at. These fires are really significant, they're really damaging, they're bad, and we would like to prevent them or reduce the risk of them, but they don't tell the whole story. So we have fuel, we've got some chemistry and some physics that you've all remembered very carefully. We have drivers of fire, as in weather. Humans cause 90% of fires. They don't do it on purpose. It's accidents, willfulness, silliness sometimes, stupidity occasionally. 95% in Europe are caused by people, In Canada, because of the north, and Russia's similar, about 50% of their fires are from lightning. But the global average for lightning is about 10%. So in most places, rule of thumb, 90% of fires are caused by people. While they're caused by people, the reason they get large or big or damaging is because of the fuel. As in, where are they burning, what are they burning in, how fast are they burning in that. If we don't have fuel, we don't have fires. If we don't have people, we don't have fires because we don't have ignitions, but that's a bit difficult to manage. The factors that drive vegetation, fuel, land use change, people's use of land, and a lot of those things are influenced by policy. So the Common Agricultural Policy here in Europe has been a significant influence on fire through the influence on fuels and their accumulation. Often economics. So in Indonesia, the main driver of fires in Indonesia is to do with agribusiness and agricultural investment, which is changing the land. And then finance. Arson, you'll see this a lot. Everyone talks about arson fires. It's a really vanishingly small proportion of fires. People don't on purpose deliberately light a fire to cause damage. There are people who do that, but it's a completely well analysed psychological problem, and it's always associated with buildings. Arsonists light fires in buildings. They don't light fires in the open. So the next time you want to call me an arsonist, you have to stop, and you can't do that. So in the past, and if you reflect on both FAO projects, but certainly a lot of current projects around the world in developing countries, a lot of effort and investment, it's been about fighting fires or adding capacity to fight the fires. It isn't working. We've got much more sophisticated firefighting techniques now than we had 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago. And they're not working. They're not solving the problem of damaging fires. If more sophisticated firefighting and more capacity did solve the problem, then the United States Forest Service, who spent $3 billion last year, would have solved the problem. $3 billion should be enough to fix the problem. They haven't, and the reason they haven't is because it's not fixable using this approach. You can't fight these fires. We mentioned before, it's 4,000 for direct attack, 10,000 for indirect, and 20,000 is sort of your average bad fire. So we're completely out of the game the moment the fire gets too big. So globally, we're not managing wildfire very effectively. While that might be a sort of straightforward statement for California, because people are dying and they're losing houses and things, it's a fundamental statement for Ethiopia. It's a fundamental statement for Kenya. It's a fundamental statement for Myanmar or Thailand, because there the people are losing their livelihoods or they're having to do other things for a while. They're taking children out of school because they have to pay for food and they can't leave the children in school. All these things are happening, so it has lots of implications. There is a global framework, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. It's a very good document, it's a solid document. The key point they make a number of times is you need to understand the fire risk. So you need to understand the problem. This partially explains why I keep talking about fuels and chemistry and energy and physics and whatever, because that underpins the problem. So we need to understand that. I'm happy to take responsibility for understanding that, but I want all of you to at least have an idea there's something else on. For the Sustainable Development Goals, obviously in this division we talk a lot about forests and we talk about Goal 15, which is life on land. But for fires, they affect the others as well. As I mentioned, in relation to Ethiopia, people burn crops, fields, assets, so they're more exposed to poverty. They're also more exposed to hunger, health and well-being. I mentioned earlier that extremely long list of things that fires produce that have health implications. Clean water and sanitation. The bulk of the water that we drink and use around the world comes from catchments. And when fires burn those catchments, it has implications for the quality and the quantity of the water and what's in the water as a result of being burned. Climate action, fires obviously are a source of emissions. Generally, if it's a natural process and you burn some grass and it grows back, then you've recaptured the carbon at any rate. What you haven't recaptured is the oxides of nitrogen and methane, which will influence climate. So it has an influence. Where you're changing the landscape and burning vegetation, then everything that's emitted by the burning is going into the atmosphere and affecting climate change. Life below water. Nobody smiles, so that's good. Related to catchments, if you have a really bad fire event, you can cause all sorts of trouble with what gets washed into the sea. So it can affect things like mangroves. There were a couple of fires many years ago near the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and the sediment flows onto the reef caused all sorts of trouble for reef health and vitality, and similar for other things. Life on land we mentioned, of course. So there's more to it than those things. How is FAO approaching those? You know the strategic objectives. There won't be a quiz on this because you all have committed them completely to memory and you know them back to front. We're about hunger and making agriculture and fishery and forestry more sustainable. We want to reduce rural poverty, agricultural and food systems, and resilience of livelihoods from disasters, one of which is fires. Wildfires threaten the implementation of just about every FAO effort we have. I remember talking to forest landscape restoration people who did a presentation. I said, this is fantastic. Look how much fuel you're creating and what are you doing about it? And of course they hadn't thought about that quite that way at that stage, but we're working on it. The same with sustainable management of forests, UN RED, climate change adaptation, drylands and action against desertification. All of those things are designed to increase resilience, part of which is by getting vegetation, suitable and appropriate vegetation, either back in place or in place to support livelihoods. Terrific, but the moment the fuel joins up or there's more than 10 tonnes a hectare, we have to be thinking about what else we need to do. There won't be anything terribly dramatic or sophisticated that needs to be done, it just needs to be part of the routine in the process. Last year, the Committee of Forest Organisations requested FAO to clarify and better articulate its work on fire management. So we've prepared a fire management strategy, which is now finalised, and I'm not sure whether there's plans to circulate it or not. It's an internal document, not an external document. Okay, so how do we, there's a lot of things in there. How do you sort of pull it together and do it in a way that it makes sense and is relatively quick? The fire management framework is a thing that evolved over many years. It's just some common sense things. It was first formulated in 2000. It's been updated a little bit since, but it's relatively simple. First step, review and analyse the fire issue. How much fuel have you got? Who's lighting the fires? Where are they lighting the fires? When do they light the fires? And really critically, why do they light the fires? What can we do, understanding those things, to reduce the risk of fires? Can we stop burning agricultural residues? Can we put power lines underground? All those sorts of things. There will always be fires, so we need to be ready to fight fires, but we need to be ready in an appropriate way. Is it a community-based approach? Do we need specialised people or not? Then we need to respond to unwanted and damaging fires, and then importantly we need to recover. So we need to help the community to recover, we have to help the landscape to recover, the watershed, the catchment, the forest. The third and fourth of these are the things that people have been doing pretty well for a very long time. Getting ready to fight fires and fighting fires. The first two and the last one, so review and analysis, risk reduction and recovery, have not been done very well, almost anywhere in the world, developed or developing. So there's a couple of things we need to focus on. Fortunately, that comes in a single page. So the whole thing is on one page. So the tools you can use, the sort of data sets that are of interest and so on, and the sort of tactics and strategies you might use. FAO has quite a few people that we work with. Obviously, the key people we work with are in the regions and our country offices. We have 130 of those. That gives us a unique opportunity to understand the country context and understand fires a bit more clearly from an insider's perspective. You know, we have people that live and work in the countries. We also work with a range of others, Silver Mediterranean Fire Working Group, North American Forestry Commission Fire Management Working Group, some of the other commissions, Near East and North Africa in particular, expert group on forest fires of the European Commission, where FAO is an observer, a very rich source of ideas and systems and processes. GOFSI Gold, which is remote censoring, that's the Global Observations of Forest Cover group. European Forest Fire Information System, which is also going to be and is hosting the Global Wildfire Information System. And then the United Nations Decade of Disaster Risk Reduction and some regional organisations, such as ASEAN and so on. What are we focusing on? Where's our value? Obviously, we don't have any firefighting equipment and we're not going to be fighting fires. We're not going to be doing research because our research capacity is slim, but we need to work with others to do those things. So the focus areas we have, and these are in the strategy, are to build the understanding of fires. The big gap in everybody's fire management planning is their understanding of the fire problem. So FAO can help them to build on that. What are the facts around fires? So we go back through the presentation and it's about chemistry and physics and weight and energy and all those things. What's the information for fire history? Where do you have it? I've been to a number of countries where they've invited us in because they've got a fire problem. I say, okay, tell me about your fire problem. How many fires do you have? They say, lots. I say, okay, how big are they? And they say, really big. I say, well, where are they? And they say, everywhere. Okay, what are the impacts? Oh, lots of damage and loss. It's because there isn't any systematic way of collecting data and so on. Luckily, since 2000 particularly, remote sensing can give us some ideas about that as a starting point. Remote sensing can't help you understand your fires. It can't tell you the stories, it can't explain why, but it's a starting point. The other thing we want to do is to work on fire emissions guidance. Nearly every developing country has included land and land use in its nationally determined contribution. Almost none of them have identified fires as a source of emissions. When they get to the end of the first reporting period, they will be scrambling, I suspect, to find out how to estimate emissions from fires and make the policy decisions about which fires should be in and which fires should be out, and then the scientific and technical questions about how to calculate it and what to do with it. So FAO is working to help with both of those things. The first one is obviously really critical to help a country understand and then pull in the resources to educate, inform, develop a system, plan and do operational and management work. The second is to do with global processes. So what we want is a lot less of this sort of intervention of people in bright coloured uniforms fighting fires, and a lot more of this. Local people talking about their issue, communicating about their issue in their own way and in their own language. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed, Peter. That was a run through a lot of information. Still expecting the test, so I guess this will be after.
I'll circulate it this afternoon.
And you mentioned a video afterwards. Would you want to try to show that now, or should we go to a round of questions? I remember you had some.
There is, I think
video
perhaps.
fighting rather than firefighting.
Yeah, perhaps questions. I think first.
Yeah. So let's open the floor. Is there a way to connect to people online whether they have any questions? Any way to do that? If not, that would be us here in the room.
I think they should listen to what we are saying and they can.
Yeah, we don't see, we have no way of seeing whether anybody raises the flag. I don't know whether you have microphones switched on, otherwise you just please scream and we'll try to listen. Any questions here in the room as we have, I think, some 20 minutes or so to go?
Or
Ben.
fire in 2016 in India, in Uttarakhand. After that, and you also mentioned, which was interesting to me, that I think it was about 3% of the fires are most of the problem. So after those fires in 2016, they accessed this global fire monitoring network and they started sending alerts down to the forest department in the States whenever they detected, whenever there was any fire detection. Well, this was a good idea, but the problem was that they got the alerts for the 97% as well as the 3%. There wasn't a good way to distinguish the two. And building off of your last slide in terms of less of the firefighting, more of the, I think it was community monitoring, trying to get fuel loads down, these kinds of things. Could you just talk a little bit more for a few minutes on what the concrete actions could be to focus on that 3%, what could be done to deal with that 3% and how to make sure there's 95% of fires are burn as they need to, or people don't have to worry about them.
It's relatively straightforward, Ben. You deal with 100% exactly the same way. And since fires are started by people, it's a local area. Initially, it's a local area issue. So local people will know who's lighting fires, why they're lighting fires, what time of the year they do that, what the purpose is. And so if you've got an understanding and you can put some sort of monitoring in process as to, okay, it's been dry for 4 weeks, we know that all the wheat farmers are going to start to harvest, and then after they harvest, they're going to start to burn the stubble. So you have a system at the local level. One of the issues with remote sensing is not only that it picks up a lot of fires that don't become problems, but also it doesn't pick up a lot of fires. So satellites are wonderful things, but they're not the solution to the problem. They're a support or an adjunct to the problem. So what is missing in what you described, as in they send all the alerts down, they probably were accessing the NASA firm site or one of those things, completely independent, reliable, accurate within the data sites, is, data is good stuff to collect, but it needs to be turned into information. And the information then needs to inform a decision, and the decision then it needs to be an action. So satellite data, a lot of times, is just the first thing. It's just data. And so it doesn't get to the action piece. So the poor district forester and forestry staff in India who are running around trying to find 100 fires, most of which have probably been and gone before they even got there, is difficult. So they need another data stream, and then they need information to port it in. The 3% is, if you get one of those, then it's bad luck. What is happening overwhelmingly in the developing world is that they're not getting the 3%. There's a reason for that. The reason is the physics and the chemistry. They don't have fuel weights and they don't have fuel continuity like they do in other places. And the reason for that is that they've still got a dominant rural and agricultural society that is grazing animals, collecting fuel wood, managing landscape. What's happened in Western Europe, in places like Portugal, Greece, Spain, is we don't have an agricultural economy anymore. So we don't have people in the landscape. And the people that are still in the landscape are in their 60s, 70s and 80s, and they're not actively managing the landscape anymore. So one of the things that we need to think about is, well, as countries like, say, Turkey, for example, which is transitioning fairly rapidly away from an agricultural economy, and then places like Algeria, Tunisia and others, how do we make sure that they don't just do exactly what Portugal did? Because then they will get a 3% fire. So we want to try and prevent it completely at the start. The other side of that question, of course, is, well, okay, how do you help California transition away from the 3%? How do you get them down the other way? And the answers are similarly embedded in fuel arrangements, proximity, where people are and so on. So it's still a pretty basic, simple sort of a process, but you need to monitor all of it.
Anybody online? Any questions from you colleagues? If not here, Jonas, you have a question, please go ahead.
So, thanks a lot, Peter. It's been very interesting. I was at the ILO sectoral forestry meeting 2 weeks ago, and casualties and serious injury among firefighters in wildfires was mentioned a fair bit more than once.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any comments?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's that issue of 4,000 kilowatts a metre is the limit of direct attack, 10,000 is the limit for indirect. If you've got anything more than 10,000, you shouldn't be anywhere near it. You should be somewhere else. And so this is where the approach to firefighting becomes important. So what planning have you done? How do you know? So things like fire behaviour models and all of those sort of things, fuel mapping, etc. If you have a fire that escapes and gets beyond 10,000 and you have wind for the next 4 hours, you need to work out where that fire will be in 4 hours' time. Firstly, so you can make sure that anyone between where it is now and where it will be is aware of what's happening and can be evacuated, but also so that you don't put any firefighters in the process and that you don't have them in a place until 4 hours' time, when the wind stops, where we're expecting them to do anything. There are some cultural aspects to this, but there's also a gender aspect. Men tend to be more aggressive and big-chested and everything else, and they tend to fight fires aggressively, which is a really dangerous thing to do. So we've got to start to balance out the way firefighting is thought about. It should be a clinical, very structured operation that is quite willing to say, I'm sorry, we can't do anything about this fire, we have to wait until the weather changes or until the fuel changes. And we don't do that. The first time I had ever second time ever in my professional life I'd heard that was the California Emergency Services Coordinator last year. And he said, this fire, someone said, okay, when are you going to get around the fire up? He said, no, we have to wait for the weather. We have to wait for the wind to stop, and then we can start to do something about it. Until then, we protect lives and property, and we don't do anything else. That's the first time I've heard that since 1984. So that's what we need to do. There aren't, in your sort of discipline, the things you teach people about wearing the right equipment, behaving in the right way, are only designed to help them if something unexpected happens.
Yes.
Given that a fire is not unexpected when it started, you know what it's going to do, then you shouldn't remove the potential victim from the space.
Any other comments or questions? Yes, please.
Thank you, Peter. Well, it's very good science, physics and chemistry at the
Good.
first year of university. I have question, not technical questions. The questions are like, okay, if we now requested to focus on fire management and support countries. Of course, you're working on strategy, internal documents, but and you mentioned that practitioners or people that are working, for example, in dry land, their main concern is just to restore the land and to improve the livelihood. But we have to look to the fire component and the purifying, how we can reduce the potential impact or potential happening.
Yeah.
So, did you look in your strategy, or is there a specific guide or tool that can support other programs, initiatives in doing or in looking to the fire management? Or the strategy could be just the FAO vision in support of countries, or like how we can have what you mentioned in practice, especially with new initiatives or existing initiatives.
Sure.
We have a lot of concern related to dry land management, restoration lands, water management, blah, blah, blah. So how we can translate this into actual work that FAO can show the case of, for example, restoring X hectares, taking into consideration, blah, blah, blah. Or you think, for example, to just do a pilot in forest protected area, or Ramsar site, I don't know. What is the plan to make a case and good management administration and fire management?
That's a very good question. The key thing it's missing is that review and analysis. So what we have at the moment is there's a fire management strategy being prepared, the first steps of it for Sudan, for Algeria, Myanmar, and then Morocco's just had one prepared. So using those examples, it would be able to illustrate or guide people when they do the review and analysis, and you find out that, say, grass is a key issue, or crops are an issue, or regenerating forest is an issue. Here are some examples of what the responses, what people did in terms of reducing risk for those sorts of areas. The context of things, country to country, even within country, is often so diverse that you can't, to come up with a sort of a guidebook, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, other than at a general level like the framework, is you run some risks. So in Sudan, for example, the people that light fires include the sesame seed growers, the local farmers, the pastoralists and the nomadic pastoralists. And they all do them in slightly different ways at slightly different times of the year in slightly different parts of the country. And then occasionally they interact. Now, you could write a very nice, clear story about that, but in South Sudan, that's not the way it works. It's different. And in Ghana, it's different. So you go back to the start, not unfortunately, you go back to the start and work through. Now, sometimes that can be, review and analysis can be really quick because people know what the situation is. It's easy to find sources of information, people to talk to. And then you move on into the technical guidance, for dry lands, or whether it's for, as you say, for a Ramsar wetland or anything like that. So I'm always going to push you back towards the principles and the process. Because as FAO in Rome, the operational stuff we see from the terrace on the 8th floor is not very much. So we need to have something we can give to people in a package that they can walk through. We then help them either directly or by identifying people and sources that can support the data collection or the analysis and so on and so forth.
Thank you. We still have a few minutes, so I have a question as well, Peter.
Yes, sir.
Or one or two. One of the things that you mentioned is the human factor and the absence of arsonists out there in the fields. But you haven't talked much about how many of the fires are actually prescribed or sort of managed, and how many are getting out of control or are completely unmanaged. Because there seems to be quite a bit of the former also. So if you could say a word or two on this. The other one that you mentioned in the passing is remote sensing, calculating, and the use of remote sensing in calculating risks, managing, sort of helping in the disaster risk reduction planning, but also damage assessment. You said you are involved in a few things there. And the last one, linking what you just touched upon, is as we go into getting a bit more of a disaster risk lens with all the climate change heating up, if you want, how the expertise of fire management could help us in efforts on ecosystem restoration, etc., where obviously this should be an integral part from the start. So how you see the interlinkage of what you are doing with broader efforts, and the broader efforts again somehow connect to technology, because obviously IT nowadays and digital information networks is on a very different level, even in countries like Tanzania or Kenya than 20 years ago. So 3 points.
Thank you. Yeah, I deliberately talk about fires as fires, and there's a continuum from somebody who perhaps burns a pile of agricultural residue that they've raked into a small pile, all the way through to Fort McMurray. And some of those, along that spectrum, some of those things are deliberate, on purpose. The bulk of them that are deliberate, prescribed burns, are started for a purpose, meet that purpose, and don't cause any trouble. So the bulk of fires do that. So a lot of, Ben was mentioning that the poor forestry people suddenly got hundreds and hundreds of things they had to look at. The bulk of those would have been disposing of agricultural residues or preparing sites for agriculture. Prescribed burning for operational, for production use like that is relatively straightforward. Prescribed burning for ecological purposes is a different ballgame altogether because of the complexities involved and things like the time between fires, the intensity of the fire, the season of the fire, all of those things come into play. So there aren't very many well-planned, well-thought-out, well-executed prescribed burning regimes for ecology around the world. There's a few, but not very many, which is a testament not that they're not needed, but that they're complicated to work on because they become social and political as well. So it's a continuum. If you get a country like Indonesia, for example, they have roughly the same amount of ignitions every year. What happens in a really dry year is that a higher proportion of those ignitions move off where they were supposed to be. Because the land next door is not yours and it's not of interest to me, then I don't help you put it out and the fire just heads off. If it's dry enough and you're in a peatland area, then maybe the fire ends up as a peat fire and Indonesia ends up back in that cycle again. So deliberate and so on. So part of a risk reduction might include deliberately lighting fires at different times of the year or for different purposes and so on. So it's a continuum. I don't see it as a do or don't type of thing. Remote sensing, I first probably should confess that I'm a technocratic cynic. I've seen so many brand new whiz-gig things that actually don't make any difference or don't help us very much. Remote sensing is not one of those. It can help, but again, as I mentioned in terms of review and analysis, just because, to Ben's point again, just because someone's told you there was a fire there doesn't mean that you understand it. And in fact, depending on the satellite, you may not even know exactly how big it was, and you may not have its location precise either. In terms of damage and loss, some of the newer satellites have this capacity to do differential between passes and things like that, to assess things like biomass volume, changes in reflectance, etc. All of which can be transformed into an indicator or a proxy for either biomass change, biomass loss, etc., etc. They're still proxies and they're still, 3,000 or 4,000 kilometres up. So you still need to engage at the local level with understanding what's happening. You cannot, in my opinion, you can't use satellites for your fire reporting and recording system. You have to have a system that's run by an agency or agencies that's collaborating to do that, because you just don't get the detail you need for the analysis. So satellites give you a really good place to start, and they're working towards giving us contributions to estimations of various things. Most of those things you might see or hear in the press or in the research literature are research products. They're still being worked on. The platform that's the most stable and useful is MODIS, because it's been worked over and looked at and researched and operationalised to an extent. Of course, that's good news. The bad news is that both of those satellites, MODIS Aqua and MODIS Terra, are both at least 7 years beyond their use-by date. They're supposed to have crashed out of space already, and they could do that any minute. So we've got to look at satellites. I think we should use them as much as we can, but we've got to understand what their limitations are. In terms of fire management and integrating it across our programs and with our programs, that's exactly what we should be doing. Drylands people should think, oh, hang on, we've got to think about fires. Watersheds people and mountains people should think about fires. My job as a technical specialist should be to help other people implement their programs. You know, we don't need a fire management unit. We don't need somebody monitoring fires for countries and all that sort of thing. That's not. I have to add value to those things by getting into that. So the process of understanding where we've come from, preparing the strategy, putting the fire management framework on the table and those sorts of things, that's an easy way to work with FIDA about, okay, you've got a new project or a new program, this is what we need to think about engaging. And of course, build up a team of others in our regions and countries that can do that with us.
Thank you, Peter. That was detailed and exhaustive responses. A last call to our colleagues on the screens. I was informed that the screen actually did not work for the PowerPoint. Just to reassure you that we will, Peter, you can make accessible the PowerPoint, but certainly also the video would be then posted so that you can see both of that. So apologies, some technical hiccup obviously happened here. If there is no other comment, any questions, comments from anybody in the room? If not, I would really thank you, Peter, for all the efforts that you have taken to update us on the fire management issue and its relevance, and also how we can connect to you, as you said. So thank you very much.
No.
I'd like to encourage everybody to just do the same, and show your work and how it links to other things that we do, including from the regional offices. Or if you have ideas how to follow up on these individual topics that we have had, just please do come forward with your suggestions. So, thank you, Peter. Thank you. On the other side of the screen. Thank you again, Peter.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, everybody.